Introduction. This is the third video in a series of 3 using the Black Pygmy historical narrative found in Taiwan, Australia and New Zealand to examine how battles over indigenous history can disenfranchise indigenous groups even when attempts are being made to restore their history accurately. This video addresses these topics. 1. Debunking Taiwan's pygmy myth. 2. Debunking Australia's pygmy myth. 3. Debunking New Zealand's pygmy myth. Use the timestamps in the video description to navigate the content. Debunking Taiwan's pygmy myth. The myth of an ancient group of black pygmies living in Taiwan is now firmly entrenched in popular memory. However, close inspection of the indigenous stories on which this myth is based demonstrates serious inconsistencies and suggest the stories have been changed quite dramatically over time. In Taiwan, the Saishat Pasta'ai festival, commemorating the death of a group of short people killed by Saishat ancestors, is the primary source of the myth. Nevertheless, firm conclusions are often drawn from this story, despite the fact that the story itself is highly uncertain in its details. The exact age of the festival is difficult to establish. An article in the BBC News in 2006 says, quote, that ritual ceremony is said to have been carried out for as many as 400 years, end quote. This appears to be the most commonly cited figure. However, an article on the festival in the Taipei Times in 2004 indicates that the Saishat people themselves are unclear about exactly how old the festival is. The article notes that some Saishat people say the festival, quote, had been going on for 400 years, end quote, while one elder said it was, quote, sometime in the last century, end quote. Even if the festival is 400 years old, that would mean it is surprisingly young. It would also mean that the earliest Saishat records of the pygmy people, called the Da'ai, only go back 400 years. Additionally, if the legend is true, that would mean that Da'ai were still living during the time of Taiwan's settlement by the Chinese, Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese, and we could expect them to have records of these people. However, none of these settlers mention encountering any such people. In fact, the reverse appears to have happened. In an article published in 1967, anthropologist Raleigh Ferrell noted that, quote, early Chinese settlers promptly picked up the stories of dwarves current among the Formosan tribes, end quote. So settler accounts of short people in Taiwan were not the product of them meeting indigenous Negrito tribes, but the product of them adopting local indigenous stories. There is at least some evidence for the Saishat elders' claim that the festival itself is only around 100 years old. There are no historical accounts of the festival by the Chinese, Dutch, Spanish, or Portuguese settlers. In fact, the earliest written record of the festival only dates to 1906. An article in the Taipei Times on the 22nd of November 2020 notes a drawing of a festival participant, quote, appeared in a 1906 issue of Record of Taiwan's Customs, end quote, adding, quote, 10 years would pass before the temporary Taiwan Old Customs Investigation Committee published the earliest description of the ceremony, end quote. The article also observes that during the earlier occupation of Taiwan by the Chinese imperialist Qing dynasty, no records were made of the festival, explaining that, consequently, quote, little is known about the ceremony before the 1916 Japanese report, end quote. Now let's return to the claims made recently by people on the Black Lives Matter Taiwan Facebook page. The group's admin stated that he believed there had been a systematic attempt, quote, to cover up the fact that they were black people, end quote, also claiming that there had been gradual efforts, quote, to demonize them, end quote, saying, quote, earlier articles mentioned the fight over a love affair. You've gradually changed it over the past years to molestation and now rape, end quote. Another poster also claimed that, quote, there is an agenda to readily discredit and erase their identity as black, end quote. Responding to comments that the oral histories of the Da'ai were inconsistent and unsupported by either archaeological or genetic evidence, This second poster also made the claim that, quote, "We know that they were referred to as black for centuries, and seeking to discount the oral passing of history is unwise and very colonizing at its root," end quote. Adding, quote, "Geneticists haven't devised a test that can conclusively determine a person's race," end quote. The admin added a post saying, quote, "There's been gradual removal of the dark skin and a systematic blaming of the extinct tribe by Taipei Times," end quote. They clarified that, quote, "They were Negritos, not Africans, but they were black," end quote. To what extent are these claims true? Let's deal first with the idea that the Taipei Times used to refer to the Da'ai as black, but no longer does so, and that the Taipei Times has also increasingly sought to demonize the Da'ai by abandoning the description of the Saishat people's dispute with them as arising from a love quarrel, and gradually describing it as rape. Although the sources I'm going to quote variously refer to the short people as little people, pygmies, and dwarfs, there are problems with all of these terms since they have distinctive meanings in English, and sometimes derogatory meanings, which are very misleading in this context. Consequently, from this point I will be referring to the short people with the Saishat name for them, Da'ai. It is true that the Taipei Times has referred to the Da'ai as, quote, "little black people," end quote, in the past, in at least 2 articles in 2004. However, there is no evidence that the Taipei Times has changed its description of the original dispute between the Saishat people and the Da'ai from a mere love quarrel to outright rape. As early as November 2004, 16 years ago as of current date, a Taipei Times article described the dispute as arising from when, quote, "the little black people sexually harassed some Aboriginal women," end quote. The next month, in December 2004, another article by the same author in the Taipei Times similarly described the dispute as arising when the Da'ai, quote, "sexually molested an Aboriginal princess and her handmaidens," end quote. The same article explicitly describes the Da'ai as having, quote, "raped the Saishat women," end quote. So the Taipei Times has been recording this dispute as arising from a sexual assault, specifically a rape, for at least 16 years as of current date. Claims that this description is simply racist historical revisionism intended to demonize the Da'ai also run into the problem that the description of the dispute as arising from the sexual assault of Saishat women was provided to the Taipei Times by a Saishat elder, Min, who is quoted directly in the December 2004 article. So this is not a recent invention by the Taipei Times attempting to demonize the Da'ai. It is part of the Saishat people's own oral tradition about them. Additionally, much earlier descriptions of the dispute also mentioned the Da'ai's offensive behavior toward the Saishat women, not merely a love quarrel. The 1996 Republic of China yearbook says the Da'ai, quote, "harassed and threatened the Saishat women," end quote. This is much more than a love quarrel. Decades earlier, an anthropological study written by a Taiwan researcher in 1967 says the Da'ai, quote, "do some rude thing to their women," end quote, angering the Saishat people. It is very clear that the euphemistically described rude thing done to the Saishat women was not merely a love quarrel. Even earlier, a Taiwanese anthropological paper written by Henli Lin in 1956, which specifically studied the Saishat Bas Da'ai ceremony, its songs, and its accompanying stories, described the Da'ai as, quote, "feared for their taking liberties with women," end quote. Again, very clearly not describing a mere love quarrel, but something far more sinister. In case it's unclear that these liberties were not merely harmless flirtation, Lin cites a part of the Saishat history of the Da'ai, writing, quote, "a Saishat divorces his wife who has been violated by the dwarfs and helplessly watches her following them," end quote. The word violated is very clearly not a reference to a mere lover's quarrel, but a description of sexual predation. It should be noted that the Saishat text from which Lin derived this interpretation is somewhat vague, and his reconstruction of its meaning has been criticized by a later scholar. We will return to that point later. However, as we have seen, other parts of the Saishat records indicate very clearly that such behaviour is part of the Saishat history of the Da'ai. Most importantly for the current context, it is clear that the idea of the Da'ai being sexual offenders against the Saishat is definitely not a modern invention, certainly not part of some campaign of historical revisionism by the Taipei Times, since it is found in Taiwanese academic literature on the Saishat sources, reaching back as far as the 1950s. So there does not appear to be any evidence that the Taipei Times has recently changed its description of the event from a mere lovers' quarrel and only recently started describing it as a rape. Additionally, it is clear that descriptions of the Da'ai committing sexual assaults can be found as early as 60 years ago in standard scholarship, not to mention in the Saishat records themselves. This is certainly not a new idea made up by the Taipei Times to discredit the Da'ai. Now let's return to the idea that the Da'ai were originally described as black. In fact, one of the contributors to the Black Lives Matter Taiwan Facebook page claims they were, quote, referred to as black for centuries, end quote. However, no evidence for this claim is provided. Is there any evidence? The first challenge we meet is the fact that the Saishat word for the Da'ai says nothing about them being black. The Saishat name Da'ai translates simply as dwarf. The ritual they celebrate in commemoration of these people is called the Pas Da'ai, often translated as the ritual to the short people, sometimes translated more simply as dwarf spirit sacrifice or dwarf spirit ceremony. Again, there is no reference at all in this name to the blackness of these people. In fact, it is clear that historical descriptions of these people have differed widely in the past, with the idea that they were black only arising gradually and comparatively recently. The Republic of China Yearbook for 1996 cites the Saishat story about the Da'ai, saying they were, quote, a group of 3-foot-tall, dark-skinned dwarfs, end quote. However, 3 years earlier, the Republic of China Yearbook in 1993 had a distinctly different description, referring to, quote, a group of 3-foot-high dwarfs, end quote, without identifying them as black. In fact, no comment is made about their colour at all. This is part of a larger body of evidence that some earlier sources did not originally refer to them as black, and that this description only emerged later. In 1986, a paper in the Bulletin of the Institute of Ethnology at Academia Sinica, Taiwan's National Academy, refers to the Da'ai as, quote, dwarfs, end quote, and, quote, little folk, end quote, but not as black. Rather than identifying them as an ancient black pygmy people who were exterminated, the paper even suggests identifying them with the Kulon, a Taiwanese plains-dwelling indigenous people. It is difficult to establish exactly when and why the Da'ai first started being referred to as black, but it seems clear they have certainly not been known as black for centuries. In fact, the earliest references to them being black appear to have arisen as a result of Taiwanese and European scholars attempting to explain their origin. The most distinctive feature of the Da'ai cited by earlier researchers is not their blackness, but their extremely short stature, supposedly no more than 1 meter tall. It seems that scholars were attempting to identify the Da'ai on the basis of their height, and consequently associated them with the Negrito pygmies found elsewhere in the Southeast Asia Pacific. As an example, a paper by a Taiwanese researcher all the way back in 1967 notes that, quote, differing stories about dwarfs are reported from the Atayal and the Bunun, but all versions agree that the dwarfs are extremely short, end quote. Note how nothing at all is said about these people being black. Rather, the most consistent point of agreement among the different indigenous people who speak of them is their shortness. Importantly, this scholar then writes, quote, these extinct short people might be related to the Negrito pygmies still found in the Philippines and the Malay Peninsula, end quote. Note how the identification of the Da'ai with the Negrito pygmies is made on the basis of them being very short, nothing to do with them being black. But having identified the Da'ai with the Negrito pygmies, it would then be a natural assumption to conclude that they were black. This seems to be the way in which the blackness of the Da'ai gradually started to appear in scholarship, despite the lack of historical accounts actually referring to them as black. Further evidence for this is found in Henley Lin's 1956 study of the Saishat descriptions of the Da'ai as recorded in their traditional songs and ceremonies. Lin describes the Bas Da'ai festival as taking place as, quote, a service to the spirits of the swarthy dwarves, possibly Negritos, who are believed to have dwelt in their neighbourhood a long time ago, end quote. The fact that Lin refers to the Da'ai as swarthy indicates that he believes they were black. But on what basis did he draw this conclusion? Lin quotes extensively from the Saishat texts recording the history of the Da'ai and the songs of the Bas Da'ai ceremony. However, it is curious that in his 78-page paper, he refers to the Da'ai as Xiao Hei Ren, in English, little black people, only 3 times. Even more significantly, none of those occasions involve him translating the Saishat text. In fact, there do not appear to be any references to the Da'ai being black in any of the Saishat records he quotes. There is reference to large black cicadas, but no reference to small black people. Now let's return to the issue of Lin's reconstruction of the Saishat texts. It is noteworthy that Saishat records of the Da'ai are often imprecise in their level of detail and sometimes vague or obscure in their descriptions of the Da'ai. The songs are high-context literary works, clearly relying on knowledge of an established oral tradition already understood by both the singer and audience. They often lack precision simply because they don't need to be more precise about details which are assumed to be already known. In a paper published in 1968, entitled Negrito Ritual and Traditions of Small People on Taiwan, anthropologist Raleigh Ferrell reviewed Lin's earlier work on the Saishat traditions and songs of the Da'ai and observed some weaknesses in Lin's reconstruction of their content. Ferrell pointed out that the Saishat traditions were not always very clear, writing, quote, Lin himself mentions the vagueness of Saishat concepts concerning the Da'ai, end quote. Ferrell also criticizes Lin's reconstruction and translation of the Saishat songs, arguing that Lin renders them far more confidently than the content would seem to warrant. Ferrell writes, quote, various parts of the Bas Da'ai are purported by Lin to refer clearly to dwarfs, end quote, and quotes Lin's translation of one of the songs, which Lin summarizes as, quote, a Saishat divorces his wife, named Waru, who has been violated by the dwarfs, and helplessly watches her following them, end quote. However, Ferrell questions the accuracy of this summary, saying that when the actual Saishat text provided by Lin is read, it translates far more simply and definitely less clearly. Ferrell gives the following translation, quote, verse of the bongo tree, repeatedly compelled, rejected by Warung. She goes yonder to you, goes unwillingly. We pity you, Warung, end quote. This is obviously far less precise and more obscure than Lin's summary. It is true that there seems to be some semantic warrant for Lin's reconstruction of the text. Phrases such as, quote, repeatedly compelled, end quote, goes unwillingly, end quote, and, quote, we pity you, Warung, end quote, certainly seem to indicate an unpleasant experience being described with discrete euphemisms. Nevertheless, the main point to remember is that this demonstrates the Saishat records of the Da'ai are far less certain and clear than they are represented by many modern descriptions of them. Ferrell's own conclusion is that the Saishat records of the Da'ai cannot be relied on as accurate historical records of an ancient pygmy people in Taiwan. He writes, quote, on Taiwan, as elsewhere, there is simply no evidence to support a belief that any of the stories have any factual value as indicating the earlier presence of Negritos, end quote. Very usefully, Ferrell also identifies external influences which have resulted in local myths emerging in Taiwan. He cites Chinese in modern-day Tainan, one of Taiwan's provinces, talking of villages which they believe were once populated by what they call black ghosts. Anthropologists do not claim that these stories are reliable evidence for the villages originally being occupied by dark supernatural beings. Instead, Ferrell suggests that these stories were, quote, possibly aided by lingering memories of the Negro slaves brought to Taiwan in the 17th century by the Dutch, end quote. This may even explain the origin of the Saishat Da'ai traditions. If Taiwan was originally inhabited by a group of small black people, it is curious that the Saishat traditions are virtually the only historical evidence ever cited for them. There are a few stories of very short people in the oral history of other indigenous people in Taiwan. In 1964, Japanese anthropologist Toichi Mabuchi wrote a paper entitled Tales Concerning the Origin of Grains in the Insular Areas of Eastern and Southeastern Asia, in which he mentioned a tradition of the Gatungulan tribe of the Bunun people, describing a hole from the earth down to the underworld, where there was a population of very small people less than 1 meter high. However, he says nothing about them being black. Importantly, no archaeological evidence has ever been found for any pre-indigenous black pygmy people in Taiwan. An anthropological paper published in 2003 stated that although there is some evidence for Taiwan's occupation by people before the current indigenous people arrived, quote, there is little direct support for the existence of an earlier so-called Negrito population in Taiwan prior to their arrival, end quote. Similarly, in an interview with the BBC News in 2006, anthropologist Jia Wu of National Taiwan University acknowledged that, quote, although in historical letters by Dutch traders in the 16th century, there were mentions about short people, end quote, and, quote, several other indigenous tribes also have legends about small people, end quote, nevertheless, quote, we haven't found any physical remains of pygmies in Taiwan, end quote. In 2019, an article by Chen et al., which examined the mitochondrial DNA of Taiwan's Saishat people, looking for any evidence of a genetic connection with Negritos, noted, quote, to this day, no archaeological evidence has ever revealed the past presence of Negritos in Taiwan, end quote. The article made this point repeatedly. Despite citing, quote, some Chinese accounts of small, dark-skinned people with curly hair in Taiwan, end quote, it insisted, quote, to date, Taiwan has no archaeological human remains supporting this hypothesis, end quote. It also noted, quote, the presence of Negrito is still existent in the Philippines and other parts of Peninsular East Asia, but not in Taiwan, end quote. Noting that various mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome studies, quote, have established a significant common ancestry between the populations of Taiwan and the Philippines, end quote, Chen et al. Wrote that, quote, it is therefore expected to find a Negrito signature in Taiwan, end quote. Consequently, their study aimed to, quote, analyze the mitochondrial genetic polymorphism of the Saishat tribe and search genetic evidence of the speculated presence of Negritos in all Taiwan indigenous groups, end quote. However, contrary to expectations, no Negrito genetic signature was found. The article concluded that out of 4 mitochondrial DNA haplogroups common to Southeast Asian Negritos and Taiwan's indigenous northern tribes, only one of them, quote, may represent a common Negrito genetic legacy of the Saishat and Atayal tribe, end quote. This was then qualified by the statement, quote, this finding must be taken with caution as the mid-Neolithic coalescence age estimate of D6A is too shallow, end quote. The authors also noted that, quote, no support was given from the Y chromosome analysis for Saishat and Atayal, end quote. Their study concluded that there was no archaeological or genetic evidence for Negritos in Taiwan. In contrast, there is clear archaeological, linguistic, and phylogenetic evidence for Taiwan's current indigenous people having arrived at least 6,000 years ago, before some of them migrated southwards from Taiwan to other regions of Southeast Asia. Debunking Australia's pygmy myth. Today, the myth that Australia was originally populated by black pygmies who were wiped out by the current Aboriginals is still popularised by conservative right-wing pundits for their political purposes. However, it is also sometimes promoted by liberal New Age type historical revisionists who believe there has been a conspiracy to cover up this knowledge. In reality, there is no archaeological or genetic evidence for the existence of any such people in Australia. The dominant narrative has been that these pygmy people supposedly continue to survive in the rainforests of far north Queensland. Nathan Mudwi's sentence, a Wiradjuri man from the Mogi clan, cites the oft-repeated claim that, quote, there is evidence of a different race of First Peoples around Karoonda and Cairns in Queensland who are smaller in stature and are believed to be pygmies, end quote. Sentence then goes on to dismiss this spurious theory, explaining that fossil evidence dating back at least 11,700 years ago demonstrates that humans in this region, quote, appear to be beyond the average height to be classified as pygmies, end quote. Sentence also cites, quote, DNA research on human fossils that are 42,000 years old, end quote, which he notes, quote, confirm Aboriginal people as the first people in Australia, end quote. Australian anthropologist Russell McGregor says that there is no evidence of early settlers recording the existence of any rainforest pygmy people in Australia. He acknowledges that some settlers, quote, mentioned a degree of shortness among rainforest Aboriginal people, end quote, but points out it was, quote, never more than a mention, end quote. Additionally, he observes that many of the colonizers, quote, made no comment at all on the stature of rainforest Aboriginal people, suggesting that they found nothing exceptional about it, end quote. McGregor also explains that this theory, originally proposed by Tyndale and Birdsall, was, quote, subjected to close scientific scrutiny and long since discredited, end quote. He cites earlier attempts to defend this theory, including a medical conference in 1962, at which one speaker claimed to have evidence for these rainforest pygmies. However, he notes that newspaper reports at the time record these claims being debunked by other conference members. McGregor describes how the notion of pre-Aboriginal black pygmies became embedded in the public imagination even as scholars were rejecting it, writing that Tyndale and Birdsall's pygmy theory failed to gain widespread scholarly support. Shoshana Grounds and Anne Ross likewise observe, quote, most Australian archaeologists would say that Birdsall's tri-hybrid model is defunct and no longer worth considering, end quote, adding, quote, unfortunately, this is not the view of many in the Australian public, end quote. They also point out how this long-defunct narrative continues to be used for conservative and right-wing political purposes, citing as examples Keith Windschuttle and, quote, writers with a particular political agenda to deny Aboriginal people legitimate native title rights, end quote. Arguably the most comprehensive dismantling of the article by Windschuttle and Gillen is a response by bioarchaeologist Michael Westerway and archaeologist Peter Hiscock entitled The Extinction of Rigor, a comment on the extinction of the Australian pygmies by Keith Windschuttle and Tim Gillen, published in the Aboriginal History Journal in 2005. This 6.5-page paper addresses all of Windschuttle and Gillen's claims and demonstrates conclusively that they are false. Westerway and Hiscock cite the standard anthropological definition of a pygmy people as, quote, populations for whom average male stature is 150 centimeters or less and average female stature 140 centimeters or less, end quote. Westerway and Hiscock acknowledge that Windschuttle and Gillen cite Birdsall, documenting people in far north Queensland as within this height range. However, they point out that this is actually a misrepresentation of Birdsall's data, noting that, quote, the average stature reported by Birdsall for males is in fact 155 centimeters in Cairns and 159 centimeters at Karoonda. Stature for females is not reported, end quote. Consequently, they conclude, quote, in the absence of an extended justification, they are too tall to be classified as pygmies, end quote. So Windschuttle and Gillen don't even represent their sources accurately. Westerway and Hiscock also address Windschuttle and Gillen's claim that skeleton fragments found at Lake Mungo and the Willandra lakes indicate the presence of a short-statured Negrito people. They then dismiss this claim, observing that, quote, biological anthropologists, including Birdsall, have failed to identify any diagnostically Negrito characteristics in the human fossil record from Lake Mungo, or, indeed, any other part of Australia, end quote. They also add that these skeletons do not appear to have been distinctively short, and were certainly insufficiently short to be classified as pygmies. Westaway and Hiscock also dismiss Windschuttle and Gillen's claims that stone tool evidence supports their pygmy thesis, writing, quote, "It is now clear that this interpretation is entirely incorrect," end quote. They explain that the stone fragments may not even be tools, but manufacturing debris, that the fragments date to only around 10,000 years ago, well within the time frame of Australia's occupation by the current Aboriginal people rather than preceding them, and that none of these fragments are chronologically associated with any human skeletal remains, making it impossible to attribute them to any pre-Aboriginal pygmy people. Westaway and Hiscock conclude that Windschuttle and Gillen, quote, "have engaged in a fanciful and ultimately superficial discussion of Australia's past," end quote, characterizing their argument as a, quote, "bizarre conspiracy theory," end quote. It is therefore clear that there is no evidence whatsoever for any pre-Aboriginal pygmy people in Australia, and that this idea was debunked and dismissed by mainstream scholarship long ago. However, for some Australian Aboriginal people, the entire discussion of Aboriginal origins and when Australia's Indigenous people arrived on the continent is irrelevant. Aboriginal woman Evelyn Arrowluan, author at the Australian Critical Race and Whiteness Studies Association, rejects scientific explanations of Aboriginal origins altogether, writing, quote, "Many Aboriginal people, including myself, don't believe in so-called migration theories and believe that we were created here on this land," end quote. Debunking New Zealand's pygmy myth. The case of New Zealand's pygmy myth is distinctly different to the other two we've considered, since in New Zealand the myth was constructed with the aid of indigenous people who also promoted and appealed to the myth for their own political gain. Historian Andrew Piper notes that the myth, quote, "was constructed as the result of collaboration between Maori and Pākehā," that's foreigners, typically white people, end quote, explaining that the two white men who wrote the myth, Smith and Best, did so in collaboration with Maori informants. He cites Hoani Turei Watahoro, a Maori scholar of the Ngāti Kuhungunu, as being particularly influential in the myth's construction. Piper says that Watahoro, quote, "furnished Smith with the law of the Wahare Mananga, or School of Learning, as supposedly taught in the 1860s, end quote, presenting this idealist and revisionist narrative as a factual record of Maori history and traditions. This information was used to construct the false narrative about the Moriori." An article in the Encyclopedia of New Zealand, published by the New Zealand Ministry for Culture and Heritage, summarizes the myth which was constructed by Smith on the basis of the information provided to him by Watahoro, who assured him that this was both authentic Maori tradition and accurate history. According to this myth, a Polynesian explorer discovered Aotearoa in 750 and found it uninhabited. Later, in the 11th and 12th centuries, two more Polynesian explorers arrived in Aotearoa and, quote, "found it inhabited by a primitive nomadic people known as the Moriori," end quote. Eventually, in the 14th century, a large group of Polynesians called Maori travelled to Aotearoa in a convoy of 7 canoes called the Great Fleet. As the myth is described by the Encyclopedia of New Zealand, these Maori, quote, "were advanced, warlike, agricultural tribes who destroyed the Moriori," end quote. This myth of an advanced Maori people arriving in Aotearoa and wiping out the timid, primitive, and uncultured Moriori was used by certain Maori groups to justify their occupation of the Chatham Islands and their murder and enslavement of the Moriori, and was also used by European settlers to justify their own colonization of Aotearoa. Since both groups found it useful for their political ends, the myth was promoted enthusiastically and rarely questioned. Piper observed that this fictional revisionism was, quote, "not unique to New Zealand or to the 19th century," end quote, citing the book The Invention of Tradition by Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger, which says, quote, "traditions which appear or claim to be old are often quite recent in origin and sometimes invented," end quote. Anthropologists have noted that during colonial occupation, Indigenous people have various motivations for misrepresenting their own history, culture, and traditions to the settler colonizers, and that the post-colonization period, and in particular the process of decolonization, both offer convenient opportunities for indigenous people to reinvent their history and revise their traditions, while asserting that they are maintaining or returning to authentic cultural concepts and practices. Sometimes indigenous people accidentally or deliberately adopt settler distortions of their own history, and sometimes they modify their history and culture in order to accommodate aspects of the colonizer culture which they find attractive but which are in conflict with their own traditions. By claiming to rediscover an earlier form of their cultural history, which they claim was previously overlooked or suppressed by the colonizers, they can integrate new concepts and practices from the colonizers without being seen as compromising the integrity of their traditional culture. In this case, some Maori leaders modified a number of their existing traditions and combined them with post hoc justifications of their conquest and enslavement of the Moriori to create a new history which was politically useful for certain Maori groups while being equally politically useful for European colonizers. Piper notes that by the 20th century, the law of the Wahare Mananga had still not been examined in detail by many scholars, and that few had assessed the motives Wadahoro had for writing it in the first place. Consequently, Piper says, quote, "The bias in this work was not exposed for many decades. A false or invented tradition was accepted as authentic," end quote. However, the myth did not go completely unchallenged. Historian James Bellish notes that it was, quote, "rejected as early as 1859 by the able historian and ethnographer Arthur Thompson," end quote, adding that in 1923, anthropologist Henry Devenish Skinner observed there was little evidence to support it. Piper likewise notes that Skinner's, quote, "extensive analysis of the material culture of the Moriori," end quote, led him to conclude that the Maori traditions and stories of the Moriori, quote, "have been shown to be worthless," end quote. In the 1950s, Skinner's work was expanded by archaeologist Roger Duff, who overturned the historical model of Smith and Best, and from this point on, the myth became systematically dismantled. However, while all this was happening in scholarly circles, the myth persisted in the public arena, among both Maori and Pakeha. Historian Michael Belgrave writes, quote, "These myths were generated in the 19th century and largely disproved by scholarship in the 20th century, but remain doggedly fixed in the popular imagination," end quote. Piper explains that this did not change until 1989, with the publication of historian Michael King's book, Moriori, A People Rediscovered, a book which Piper says, quote, "captured the public's imagination and brought real change to its understanding of this aspect of the nation's accepted narrative," end quote. Other aspects of the myth have also been debunked. Peter Clayworth writes that, quote, "the idea of Moriori extinction has also been challenged," end quote, citing descendants of the Rekohu Moriori who have demonstrated they, quote, "retained their cultural and political identity," end quote, despite intermarrying with Maori and Pakeha. The entire myth has now been completely debunked in both academic circles and public discourse. Dr. Kerry Mills of the Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand states firmly, quote, "as far as the scientific evidence is concerned, there were no pre-Maori people," end quote. She acknowledges that it is true that certain Maori groups, namely Ngāti Mutunga and Ngāti Tama, were responsible for the massacre, enslavement, and dispossession of the Moriori, saying, quote, "some Maori did kill some Moriori," end quote, and, quote, "the story is an awful one," end quote. However, she rightly objects to this historical event being used to discredit Maori people or deny them their own rights. Mills also notes, quote, "Moriori are a distinct and surviving kin group," end quote. However, uncomfortable echoes of this controversial history and its associated myth continue to be heard today. Michael King points out that, ironically, some Maori have denied the Moriori massacre, and in the process of doing so have even, quote, "denied that there had ever been a people called Moriori, either in New Zealand or on the Chatham Islands," end quote. Some tension remains between the Moriori and certain Maori groups, such as the Ngāti Mutunga, though it is gradually easing. Moriori man Maui Solomon says that some people, quote, don't want to acknowledge Moriori, end quote, adding, quote, some still deny that Moriori even exist as a people, but they're increasingly in the minority, end quote. In 2018, the Ngāti Mutunga, one of the Maori groups which conquered the Moriori, attempted to deny the New Zealand government's land grant to the Moriori, claiming that the Moriori have no exclusive right to it, having been conquered by the Ngāti Mutunga. A Ngāti Mutunga representative said that his ancestors, quote, did conquer and subjugate Moriori at that time, end quote, adding, quote, I don't think there is any other way of looking at those events than using those terms, ugly as they are by present-day ears, end quote, and arguing that this conquest dispossessed the Moriori and dissolved their claim on the land. As recently as 2019, Moriori cultural sites and sacred artifacts were desecrated and vandalized by those who believe they have no right to the land on which they live. However, these incidents do appear to have been gradually diminishing over time, and recent dialogue indicates that a significant number of people on both sides are now willing to move on together. Conclusion. History can be a minefield of truths, half-truths, distortions, revisionism, and outright lies. This is particularly the case with indigenous history, especially where settler colonizers are involved, and when their activities have obscured or corrupted available records. At the same time, indigenous records of their own history, culture, and tradition cannot be treated as necessarily pure, accurate, and unbiased, since they change over time, are sometimes revised to suit the new needs of the community, and may not necessarily be based in any actual facts in the first place. Some healthy skepticism is entirely warranted, just as it is warranted in the histories of the settler colonizers themselves. Interpretation of indigenous history is even more fraught with difficulty when competing interests are at stake, either between colonizers and indigenous people or between indigenous people themselves. Nevertheless, while skepticism of indigenous histories can be warranted, the power dynamic between settler colonizers and the indigenous people they have displaced should always be remembered, and scientific and historical skepticism should never be weaponized with the aim of justifying the invasive and destructive actions of colonizers.